I'm happy to introduce Dr. Brian Diers, presenting the development of SOYLEIC Varieties for Illinois. Dr. Brian Diers is the Charles Adler Ewing Endowed Chair of Soybean Genetics and Breeding in the Department of Crop Sciences at the University of Illinois. He currently teaches plant breeding and conducts research on soybean breeding and genetics. His research focuses on improving disease and pest resistance, seed quality, and yield potential of soybean. His breeding program is developing non-GMO varieties for commodity and specialty markets with an emphasis on developing varieties of oil that has high oleic acid and low linoleic acid. This session will discuss the development of SOYLEIC varieties with oil that has high oleic acid and low linoleic acid. In addition, the yield and agronomic potential of these varieties will be discussed today. Please help me welcome Dr. Diers to the 2022 Soybean Summit.
Today what I'm going to talk about is our breeding effort in SOYLEIC soybeans. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of background on soybean oil, talk about issues related to trans fatty acids, and how we can improve the soybean oil to increase the market share of it. I'll talk about the SOYLEIC soybeans and some of the advantages of it, and then I'll talk about our breeding program. So our efforts in developing varieties with the SOYLEIC trait that are adapted to Illinois. And then I'll also talk about some other research areas that we're working on to improve the quality of soybeans. With the SOYLEIC program, what we're doing is we're developing varieties that have high oleic acid and low linolenic acid. And I'll talk more about these different fatty acids and the importance of them later on. The goal for this effort is to increase the demand for soybean oil, and I'll talk about how the demand for soybean oil has gone down over time, and people are using other ingredients in a lot of applications, and what we want to do is bring back further demand. I'll talk about opportunities for the SOYLEIC to give you opportunities for premiums, as well as increase the profitability for soybean production. Again, if you can grow the demand for the oil, that should help increase profitability. So if we look at a soybean, the main components of it that are of interest to processors and users are the protein and oil. That's really why we grow soybeans as opposed to corn. So the soybean seed is composed of about 19% oil. This is on a 13% moisture basis. The meal is composed of the protein, carbohydrates, ash, and then we have finally 13% moisture. So again, focus of my talk is going to be on that 19% oil and how we can increase the value of it. So the soybean oil is composed of 5 major fatty acids. And this is common among other crops as well. And what I'm showing in this figure is the components of these different fatty acids for different oilseed crops. So the fatty acids are palmitic acid. This is a 16-carbon saturated fatty acid. And why I say it's saturated, what I'm saying is that it doesn't have any double bonds. So that's what makes it saturated. We know a lot about the production of these fatty acids. And what happens is that there's an enzyme that will take palmitic acid, add 2 carbons to it to give us stearic acid, which is an 18-carbon saturated fatty acid. There's another enzyme that will take that stearic acid, put in a double bond to give you oleic acid. And that's a monounsaturated fatty acid. Another enzyme will take oleic acid, put on another double bond to give us linolenic or linoleic acid, which has 2 double bonds. Again, another enzyme will take linoleic, put another double bond on it to give us linolenic that has 3 double bonds. Right? If you read about how to improve your diet, you'll know that saturated fats are not a good thing. You want to limit that in your diet. And unsaturated fatty acids are good, both the monounsaturated as well as the polyunsaturated fatty acids. So these unsaturated fatty acids are all good things to have in your diet. The issue is that the polyunsaturated fatty acids are unstable during frying and baking. And what happens is it can cause the oil to turn rancid. And I'll, again, talk a little more about that later on. So the ultimate oil would be an oil that's unsaturated, but have a high level of this oleic acid. So if we look at different crops as to what their profiles are, I show soybean, corn, olive oil, sunflower, palm, and coconut. I'm showing different colors for the different components. I'm just combining saturated, so the palmitic and stearic together with this gold part of the bar. So what you can see is that soybean, corn, olive, sunflower, they all have pretty low levels of saturated fatty acids, which is a good thing. Palm oil, high. Coconut oil, you can see very high. I think one of the ironies of the whole trans fatty acid issue, or people have gone away from using soybean oil because of the trans fatty acids, is a lot of people have been adding more palm oil to products, which, you know, they're basically making a less healthy product just because they can get around the labeling. Okay, so saturated. Then if we look at oleic acid, which is the gray area, what you can see is soybean and corn are fairly similar, sunflower a little lower, but olive oil has a very high level of oleic acid. And olive oil is actually a very good oil. People like using olive oil, and if anything, what we want to do is give soybean oil a profile similar to olive oil. You know, people don't use as much olive oil because it's very expensive. Most of the fatty acids in both corn and soybeans are this linoleic acid. So you can see over 50% linoleic, and then we have linolenic. And one difference we see soybeans compared to other commodities is that we have a high level of linolenic, which is a problem because it's not a stable oil. So again, this is a profile, and this profile, what we want to do is modify to create an oil in soybeans that's more comparable to what they have in olive oil. So I already alluded to this, but one of the issues with soybean oil is that it has this instability. And over time, or years ago, what we would do is we would get around this by hydrogenating the oil. So they would hydrogenate it, it would remove some of those double bonds, create a more stable oil, and people would use that in food products. The problem is that hydrogenation creates the trans fatty acids. And people found that those trans fatty acids were unhealthy. And in 2015, the FDA declared that partially hydrogenated oils were not generally recognized as safe. Definitely something you don't want to put in your food products, right? So I'm just showing some chips here. Not the most healthy thing you can eat, but one of the things they want to do is say they have 0 grams trans fats. And what you can see is they're not using soybean oil. They're using sunflower, corn, and or canola oil, right? So what we want to do is be able to get more soybean oils in products like this. So how can we change the profile? Again, we know a lot about this fatty acid biosynthetic process. We know what enzymes are required. Basically, what we need to do is knock out the effects of these two genes. This FAD2 gene, which takes oleic acid to produce linoleic acid, and the FAD3 gene that creates the linolenic acid. And this can be done in different ways. And for example, there are GMO products that will create this product. And this is Corteva and Bayer both developed this, and you've probably heard about Plenish soybeans. This is a high oleic soybeans that is marketed by Corteva. And again, they're able to do this through a GMO process. Basically, they put in a gene that will reduce the expression of those FAD2 and FAD3 genes. You can also produce it through gene editing. And there's a company in Minnesota called Calyx, and they've actually gene edited the FAD2 and the FAD3 gene, and now they have a low or a high oleic product that they're now marketing. And this is actually the first gene-edited food product that's come out on the market. This is not considered to be a GMO in the US, but it is in Europe and some other countries. So, you know, you don't have to worry about the GMO regulatory process in the US, but you can't make this into a commodity bean and ensure that it's not going to end up on a freighter in Europe. The other opportunity, and this is what we've been working on, is you can use mutagenesis, basically knocking out genes by applying a mutagen, or looking for natural variation to give a non-GMO way to produce the high oleic lowland soybeans. And we're pursuing this not because I'm against GMOs or anything like that. GMOs are good. They give us a lot of excellent traits and have helped soybean productivity. But one of the issues with having a GMO is it's hard to stack different GMOs together. So for example, if high oleic soybeans was a GMO, you would have to go through a whole new regulatory process to combine that with, let's say, a new herbicide resistance trait. Because this is a non-GMO product that we're working on, you can stack this with whatever GMO trait you want and not have to go through any regulatory process. Okay, so the soy-oleic trait is a result of gene mutations. Two of these mutations came from the soybean germplasm collection. So they were natural mutations that were in soybeans that were discovered. And the soybean germplasm collection is actually housed here on campus at the University of Illinois. It's only a couple miles away where the collection is. And basically they have collected all different types of soybeans. So I think there's somewhere around 20,000 different soybean types that they maintain there. And basically what happened was some researchers went through and they screened that collection for oleic acid and found some differences. Two of the mutations are gene knockouts. And they're knockouts of this FAT3 gene to reduce the linolenic acid. And this was just through breeders over time just applying a mutagenesis, so a chemical to the soybean that causes a high rate of mutations, and then just screening the progeny and identifying plants that have the right trait. The development of the soy-oleic trait was supported through the soybean checkoff, both screening the collection to identify the high oleic as well as identifying the mutations. I was a grad student at Iowa State back in the 1980s, which makes me feel really old. And they were actually working on identifying those low linolenic acid mutations back then. So this is something people have been working on for a very long time. Okay, so what we can do is by knocking out those genes, we can drastically increase the level of oleic acid and drastically reduce the level of linolenic. And this is what we're at now with soy oleic. So we're over 80% oleic acid, and we're less than 3% and around 2% linolenic. And again, our target has been more than 75% oleic and less than 3% linolenic. And we've been able to exceed this. And this compares favorably with Plenish. Plenish is around 75% oleic, 2% linolenic. Another big advantage of soy oleic is we've done trials to show that actually the trait is very stable as you go across geography. So we've had trials all the way from Minnesota to Georgia, and we can see a pretty stable oil profile. And one of the issues is that the food industry really doesn't like a trait that's going to be unstable. You know, you want to make an Oreo cookie that's going to be the same this year and next year and the following year. You don't want to have ingredients that are going to vary a lot, and it's just going to make your production difficult. So advantages of the high oleic soybean. So really we're after expanding the use of US-grown soybeans in food products. So again, high oleic soybeans, low linolenic soybeans, are resistant to oxidation under high temperatures. And what happens is that the oil can oxidize and it can give the food product a rancid flavor. Another advantage that they've found is that there's less cleanup of frying equipment. I've never worked at McDonald's, but apparently one of the issues is that after you use fryers for a period of time, somebody has to go and clean all these fryers out. And what they find is that the high oleic soybeans have less deposits, so it's just easier to clean. It also will give you better shelf life of packaged products, and also it's lower in saturated fatty acids. And I think I failed to mention that when we looked at this figure here. So we're around 10% saturated, whereas normal soybean oil is about 15%. And I'm not sure exactly why it's been reduced, but it's a happy thing to happen, is that we have lower saturated fatty acids. There's also some advantages in feeding soy oleic. And there's been some studies that are done. One study that's been recently published has shown that you can have improved milk fat by feeding the soy oleic soybeans to dairy cattle. And this would be either a toasted soybeans or extruded soybeans that would have some oil in it. And they show that that can increase your milk fat content, as well as the milk fat has a higher oleic acid level. There's other feeding studies also ongoing. Another advantage of high oleic soybeans is that there are industrial applications. And one thing that I find really interesting is that apparently high oleic soybeans makes a good aviation fuel. As we look into the future, you know, as transportation becomes more and more electrified, one of the places that we're still going to need a liquid fuel is for aviation, because you just can't fly a plane across the Pacific using batteries. You're going to need some sort of liquid fuel. And apparently, high oleic soybeans really is a good fuel for that. Also, you can use it as a motor oil. It provides higher heat stability than other oils. So the soy oleic genetics actually came from research that was done at the University of Missouri. So two colleagues of mine, Kristen Ballou, who's a USDA scientist at the University of Missouri, and Grover Shannon, who is retired, but he was a breeder down at Portageville in the Boot Hill of Missouri. They were the ones who first identified the gene combinations that could give you this trait. So this technology is owned by the University of Missouri as well as USDA, but they actually granted an exclusive license to the Missouri Merchandising Council, who are then now marketing it. And so the University of Illinois and other state universities are now breeding with this trait. So we're working closely with the soy oleic staff in Missouri, and they have people who work with the industry, processors, the food industry, who are now working to market the soy oleic product. Again, it's really a chicken and egg thing, because you need to produce the beans and have the oil there before people are going to want to use it. And so it's tricky. It's not just having a good product, but you also need to make sure there's demand for this product. So they're working very hard to develop the demand. There's also a lot of interest in Asia to import soy oleic as well. And right now, this year, what I was told was that there's a $2 to $3 premium for the non-GMO soy oleic soybeans. So there's breeding efforts for soy oleic soybeans ongoing at a number of universities. So we've got universities all the way from Minnesota to Georgia involved. The idea is that we want soy oleic soybeans to cover all major maturity groups. University of Nebraska is going to be another state that's going to start breeding this trait in 2022. And we're developing varieties through backcrossing as well as forward breeding. And I'll talk a little more about that later. We started breeding soy oleic soybeans in 2015. And our focus is maturity group 2 to 4. It's taken a while for us to get this trait into our best germplasm, because it's 4 genes that we need to stack together. So you need 2 genes to give you the high oleic, and then 2 genes to give you the low linolenic. You might wonder, why do we need 2 genes for each one? Well, it turns out that if you look at genes in soybeans, for most genes, there's 2 different copies of that gene on 2 different chromosomes. So if you knock one gene out, there's still another gene that will be basically doing the same process. So we need to knock out both copies of the gene. And if you think about it, for genes, if you make a cross between, let's say, a conventional soybean and a soyleic soybean, you grow the F1, develop an F2 population, only 1 out of 256 plants will actually be homozygous for the 4 genes that you want. So the odds are pretty low. So we have to think about novel approaches in order to get those genes combined into a good high-yielding background that growers will want to actually produce. So as I mentioned, we're doing some forward breeding. And basically with the forward breeding, I'll spare you all the details of it. But basically what we're doing is we're trying to breed this trait into our highest yielding germplasm. And then once we can fix that trait in a high yield material, we then cross different varieties, with good agronomics, the soyleic profile. We cross those together to develop big populations that are all going to have the trait that we can then select for yield and other agronomic traits. We're also using backcrossing, and we really did that at the start of the program. And we had a greenhouse or a winter nursery in Puerto Rico where this was being done. And basically, we sent our best varieties there. The 4 genes were backcrossed into those varieties, and we got them back. And now, again, this helps us get high-yielding germplasm with the trait. We're using genetic markers to select for the trait. So again, 4 genes, we have 4 different genetic markers. We have to sample plants in the field, test it with the markers, and that's going to give us, allow us to select for the trait. Missouri has recently bought a machine that will actually detect fatty acid levels on a single seed basis. So in the future, we're hoping we can send germplasm there, basically run it through the machine and start making selections with that. When I started as a plant breeding grad student, my advisor, one of the first things he told me was breeding is a numbers game, right? You can't just develop one experimental line and expect to release that as a new variety. What we need to do is develop a lot of experimental lines, and it's not dissimilar to thinking about the lottery. Your probability of winning the lottery is better if you buy 2 lottery tickets or 3 lottery tickets or 4 lottery tickets. It's still very low, but at least you've got a better probability. We're hoping our probability of developing good varieties is better than winning the lottery, but still what we need to do is develop lots and lots of experimental lines, test them agronomically, to identify the right gene combinations that will give us the agronomic performance we need. So again, this has been a big focus of our program, is to develop experimental lines that have this trait. So for example, in 2021, we had over 3,500 experimental lines with the soyleic trait, just in observation plots, over 500 in preliminary yield tests, and over 100 in advanced yield tests. So again, we're developing a lot of experimental lines that have this gene combination that we can now select for yield and other traits. So in 2022, our plan is to release 6 soyleic varieties. And this is our first releases of soyleic varieties. We have about 500 units of seed of each one, and we're now in the process of licensing these to seed companies to get production happen in 2022 so that we can have our first commercial production in 2023. So we've got 3 maturity group 2 varieties, 2 maturity group 3 varieties, and 1 maturity group 4 varieties. This just shows some roguing we did last November. So the increases were near Peoria. And we had to go up and do some roguing, and we had the pleasure of roguing during a snow squall that moved through the field. And I felt sorry. This is a grad student in my program from Turkey, and I think this is a photo she sent home to her family to say, look at what the US is like. Yeah. So anyway, I'm sure she's wondering what she got herself into, when she was out there. Okay, so data. So again, we're now in the process of releasing some varieties. So the big question is, how do they yield? And again, it's been a big focus that we know we have to recover the yield of good varieties before we can release it. So what I would say is that we're getting very close to the high yielding check. So this is from our maturity group 2 varieties, some data. As you can see, we've got a couple of ASGRO check, a public check. The ASGRO check is beating us by a couple bushels, but we're getting close. And again, you can see that we've recovered the SOYLEIC fatty acid profile. So we're over 80% oleic, below 3% linolenic. So these are some maturity group 3 varieties that we've developed, again, compared to some ASGRO checks. I'll say that the second ASGRO check is a lot later than ours, so that can explain some of the higher yield that it has. But again, we're getting it within the range of the checks. And again, this is now some of our maturity group 4 lines. So we've got a couple of commercial checks on the bottom. I can't give the name of them. But anyway, again, we're getting within the range of the commercial checks. So again, the SOYLEIC lines are the LD lines. The SA line is one from the developed from the University of Missouri. So again, we're cooperating with Missouri. The LD lines are from our campus. The important thing is to think about the breeding pipeline. And one of the things that I like to do is see, in our preliminary yield tests, are we getting lines that are better than what we've produced previously? And this is from one of our prelim yield tests this past year. And what you can see is now we're finally starting to exceed the yield of our checks with our SOYLEIC varieties. So again, we're going to retest these. Hopefully these kinds of yields will hold up and show that we're going to be able to compete with some of the best varieties out there with the SOYLEIC trait. So other research. So one of the things that I've thought about is that for SOYLEIC to work, we have to identity preserve the beans. So if we're already paying for identity preservation, can we stack those beans with other quality traits? And so one of the things we started working on was low oligosaccharides. So oligosaccharides are short-chain sugars in soybeans. And what they do is they cause a reduction in the energy value of the soybean meal. Basically, they cause digestive distress in animals. They have a hard time digesting these short-chain fatty acid or short-chain sugars. And it's especially a problem in poultry as well as weaning pigs. So what we've done is we've combined 2 genes that will decrease the oligosaccharides from around 5% to below 0.5%. And what we're doing now is working on combining that with the high oleic, low lin soybeans. And again, if we're already doing the identity preservation for the oil, why not add a good meal trait? People have worked on this meal trait in the past, the low oligosaccharides, and the problem was nobody was ever able to show enough value for it to pay for the identity preservation. But if we're already identity preserving the SOYLEIC soybeans, we could bring this along. So what we've done, we've spent a few years now working on this. So to be a breeder, you have to be patient. We've been back-crossing the 2 genes for low oligosaccharides into our high oleic backgrounds. So we now have combined the 6 genes we need for the 2 traits into 3 Illinois adapted backgrounds. Finally, this summer, we'll have plants in the field that will have all 6 genes combined together. So again, this is the start of our breeding process to combine both of these traits. Okay, so in conclusion, so SOYLEIC soybeans have the potential for increasing the market for soybean oil. We're developing varieties. We've got our first releases in 2022. We've got newer, higher yielding varieties in the pipeline. And now we're in the process of stacking the SOYLEIC trait together with the low oligosaccharides to give us both high quality oil as well as meal. So with that, I'd like to thank the funders. Most of the funding we've received so far for this project has been through USB, but we're now receiving some money from ISA, as well as we've worked closely with the Missouri Merchandising Council to help with the marketing. And then finally, if you want to claim CCA credit, you can scan this code. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jennifer.
Let's thank Dr. Diers.